Hello, podcast listeners. Thanks for dropping in on this episode. It's Crispina here.
And I'm Adrian. With us today in the studio is Aileen Wong for the limited series called The Leader's Chair, where we speak with C-suite folks about their thoughts on leadership and people management.
Aileen is the Director of Human Resources and Organisation Development at the Singapore Tourism Board, where she has been for a large part of her career.
Welcome to Work It, Aileen.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here.
Thanks, Aileen. Thanks for taking time off a very busy schedule. Okay, let's kick things off. Usually on this podcast, we ask our guests to give us a little bit of a look back on their own career. You've been with public service. We did a little CSI. So you were with GovTech before.
Yes.
So when you look back at your career, what would you say about how you've done so far? Did you always know that this was what you were going to do, or it was just a journey that you went on?
I think it's very much a journey that I went on. It was by accident that I stumbled into the HR field. When I first graduated, quite many years ago, I wanted to go into banking, but the industry wasn't doing so well. So I had a bachelor in economics. So it was really strange to find myself working in the human resource at first. I grew to like the public sector work very much because I see the impact that I was able to make, the interaction that I could have. And I think more importantly, also influencing my own perspective of how the economy was being run, how the country was being governed. And that itself gave me insights to what money cannot provide.
Ah, that's interesting. She's the second person to say.
Oh yes, Siu Ming was the previous guest on our show that also wanted to get into banking, but eventually landed in HR and has been in HR for the past 15 years, I think.
Yeah, he too said that he found it very meaningful because it was more than just the money.
I actually heard that particular episode, really just do my homework for the podcast. And many of the things that he said really resonated with me, specifically with regards to the domain of HR, where most people outside of HR might not necessarily see the complexity behind it. If you dive deeper into it, HR as a specialty is actually a science because there are many ways in which you can design policies in order to shape behavior and therefore accomplishing the organizational outcomes.
But HR is never really front and center when we talk about human behavior, but actually it is. Now it's data-driven, right?
Yep.
And so it becomes so much more real.
At the Singapore Tourism Board, we're very fortunate we have had leaders who are very supportive of HR and they really do see the importance of HR. So they've given us a lot of support in initiatives and also being able to experiment with new ideas and also in advocating, for example, wellness, particularly during the pandemic.
Yep.
So HR actually came up front and center.
And even though you have been in public service over at GovTech as well as STB, are there any differences in your approach to leadership because of the nuances between these two?
I do think leadership needs to be contextualized, both at the receiving end as well as the giving perspective. When we join an organization, very often we forget that there is an organizational mandate for which the agency is tasked to fulfill. And this applies for both the public as well as the private sector. So if you're in the public sector, say STB for instance, we very much look into building a dynamic tourism landscape that can continue to fuel good jobs for our people, continue to build up reputation for Singapore as a place where you can work, live and play. But if you look at it from the private sector, say, for example, if we look at the bank, there are certain mandates and purpose for which the bank exists to serve. So therefore, leadership in those instances need to be contextualized.
In other words, you have different demands of leaders depending on where you are and what organization you're running.
And of course, one thing we can't talk about tourism without talking about the pandemic. We understand STB
must
yourself.
have been quite traumatic compared to some others.
Yes, it was definitely very stressful and pressurizing for both our staff as well as for the industry. It being unprecedented, this pandemic has also brought about a lot of changes and adaptations that we needed to do. So there was a lot of experimentation. So for example, we rolled out the Singapore Rediscover vouchers. Even though we recognize domestic tourism would never be quite an impact, say for the likes of Japan or China, they can primarily rely on domestic tourism tourism to drive the economy. But in Singapore, it's a bit tough because our population is really small. But we saw it from a perspective that it was an opportunity for our people to get to know the tourist attractions, the different activities that we had, and also to provide a leeway for them to fulfill their travel quest, even though it's still domestically.
Did you use your vouchers?
Oh, yes, I exhausted it almost the first week by booking all trips to Sentosa and interesting places which I've never had the chance to visit. What about yourself, Crispina?
I gave it to my kids.
Oh, that's so kind of you.
Because they went on dates with their girlfriends using
nice.
my vouchers. Okay, when did you realize COVID is not going to go away? And in a way, it was a game changer for a lot of industries.
Yeah, because for many people, they would just look at SARS as a reference point.
Yes.
That lasted 6 months. But then this pandemic, we are still somewhat in it right now.
We're still.
Yes, we do see the pandemic becoming one that we need to learn to live with, just as how we do with flu. In the first year, it was a lot of struggle that we had to undergo, and also trying to not just coping internally as an organization, but also helping the stakeholders make sense of it. You can have the likes of hotels that became SHN facilities, and they found an outlet to be able to still continue to keep occupancy somewhat at a reasonable level. But you also will have the travel agents and tourist guides who really suffered very much because there are no tourists for whom they could bring around. And therefore, the Rediscover vouchers was one opportunity. And also in the same way, we also tapped on the particular pool and pivoted them temporarily to become our ambassadors. So you recall that we had many of these ambassadors going out, really encouraging people to put on their masks, making sure that the various SMM guidelines were adhered to.
We interviewed quite a few of them. They were former tour guides, and then now they had to tell people to put on their masks. And so they were saying that people were scolding us. But it's tough, right? So one of the things I wanted to add that I notice now is that all hotels have this super sanitizing thing. And it feels great that they've taken it so seriously. That's a legacy of that hard time that they had to go through, right?
If anything, the pandemic taught us it's really being a lot more conscious about our hygiene and sanitation. And I think this is something that we do recognize that tourists and locals, the same, focus on that as a baseline.
And also, of course, the whole tech thing. So now you can check in, you can order stuff, everything is seamless, right?
It is seamless. Although I would say that from a tourism perspective, we do recognize there are pockets where we can automate, there are pockets where we can try and use technology. However, there is still the face-to-face, the personal touch, which
Of course.
for travel,
really makes a difference.
Yes, otherwise you just put on the VR goggle and do your traveling.
Greeted by a robot. Okay, coming back to work. We've talked about finding meaning in work and purpose in work on this podcast before. We feel, based on our conversations, it's become more serious now. People are really asking and looking for purpose and meaning beyond just the money. Could have been because of the pandemic, but I think it's also a kind of a new generation that's now coming up and raised in self-sufficiency also. So money's kind of not that motivating. What do you personally find meaningful in your work? Do you feel that it's changed over time?
Not exactly. I feel like the factors contributing to that meaningfulness perhaps has evolved over time. Perhaps in our parents' generation, we find that then the pursuit of work is really that for survival. In earlier days, we were really just trying to make ends meet, being able to put food on the table, make sure that there's a roof over our head. And over time, we see the rise of affluence, and we are therefore privileged as we are today, able to take a step back because we feel like as a whole, we are able to find good jobs that give us decent pay so that our basic needs are met, and then therefore allowed us to pursue other facets of life. But if we come back to the whole concept of meaningfulness, I don't think that what we are looking for now is anything different from what, say, our parents or forefathers are looking for. It's just a different context and means in which they're finding fulfillment. My parents will be very fulfilled if they know that they have worked very hard and brought up their children, put them through education, enabled them channels to find a better life. Right? To them, that's their purpose and that's their meaning. For us today, when we look at the whole concept of meaningfulness, it's really then very much of what can we find fulfillment in. Perhaps material needs might not fulfill us in the same way as it did for our parents and earlier generations. And therefore, then we are on this search for something higher, a calling. Some of these words has been used out there, some higher purpose and all that.
But hard, right?
I don't think so. I feel that sometimes we forget what it was like, and we forget that we are in a privileged position that we can afford to make such decisions and such choices. Right? I
So
think
the concept of gratefulness.
Yes, I very much believe in that. I feel like if we are able to recognize the goodness in people, if we're able to recognize that each day has gone on fairly smoothly, that we're able to make contributions in our work, able to make a positive impact on someone else's life, being able to build up meaningful connections, both at work, at home, and socially, I think that in itself actually constitute meaningfulness to me.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
And one of the key challenges I do hear from many leaders is really motivating their people, especially the younger entrants to the workforce. Because as you mentioned, now it's no longer putting food on the table. The food is literally spilling over the table right now. And it goes beyond just sending them for training, for coaching, give them more stuff to do. In your experience in HR, I'm sure you have done a fair share of trying to motivate these younger entrants to work. What has worked for you, and maybe what hasn't really worked out for you?
I do think that the environment in which a company can create is very important. This is where our employees spend the most of their working hours, and they devote a considerable amount of energy and talent in building up towards our organizational objectives. Where HR on organization can come in, it's really to think about the environment, and the environment not just physically, but also in terms of what are the perks, what are the features of work that we're able to design, how are we structuring the work, the deliverers. I would say it doesn't really change, but the format in which it can be delivered, the manner in which it can manifest, as the younger ones talk about, use this term, it's really then how we want to allow flexibility and just being more open for experimentation. So there is no one way to get to Rome. If we agree as an organization, the outcome is going to be Rome, for example, then do we also provide enough leeway and support for our staff to come up with ideas on how do we get there, and whether or not
And it doesn't mean that everybody has to get there by train, for instance.
Yes. So this is where the parameters of assessment is very important, because the destination is Rome. Then do we want to add other layers of assessment? Say, for example, we are looking for speed, we're looking for comfort, we're looking for inclusivity, and therefore then you have these parameters by which staff can work within and just innovate.
Given how big STB is, wouldn't that require like 10x the team size in your department just to manage all these people?
Or a very patient leader. You might have so many different types of people.
I very much wish from HR perspective that we have a lot more people on board. Unfortunately, we are constrained by factors beyond us. And also, I think to be mindful that we don't want to be monopolizing from other agency or the private sector, right? It's the entire economy that will need this working population. I think it's therefore important to then be clear about what are the OB markers, so to speak, lines they should not be crossing, but also be equally flexible about the way in which we do things. So, for example, STB has introduced hybrid work arrangement, as with the rest of the public sector. So, officers come in 2 days a week. They are welcome to come in more if they need be, if the situation calls for it. But 2 days a week is what we set as a floor. And I think with this flexibility, officers actually appreciate the ability to be able to better manage their family commitments, their personal commitments as well. We've also introduced other means where we want to provide the environment for people to find purpose and meaning. We do recognize that it's not just going to be about work. It's also being able to say, for example, making time for learning, because growth is very important, particularly for the millennials, where we feel that they want to see themselves being able to pick up new knowledge, be able to grow, being able to reach the aspiration for higher appointments. And this is where we actually set aside pockets of time within our work week where we tell people, try not to schedule meetings. You can use that for learning purpose. Along with that, provide a whole list of programs for which they can attend as well. And there are also other channels in which we will help them to take stock of their contribution. So we do note that sometimes there could be burnout and there could be a lot of stress that they're going through, either both at work or in life, just living life. And we do have wellness ambassadors across all departments as well, whom they could reach out to and essentially just get a listening ear and some support.
That's what we are seeing as well from the people that we've been talking to. Who have you personally worked for that you really admired, and the lessons that you've learned now that you lead a huge team?
It could also be anti-lessons.
Anti-lessons.
Yeah, maybe
Non-lessons?
not just non-lessons.
What
Some
are
of the bad
non-lessons?
things that you observe and maybe telling yourself, okay,
as in
I shouldn't
not
do
so
that as a
great.
leader.
I have been very fortunate to have worked with quite a number of good leaders. I've also had my fair share of not so good leaders. So I would say that in defining a leader, it goes back to what is the context and what is the level of influence and to what extent has the person enabled me to grow as a person, right? Not just as a digit in the organization, but that really to value what I can bring to the table and also helping me to sharpen some of the skill sets. For a good leader, it's one who is able to be flexible, one who is able to identify what are some of the intrinsic needs that every team member needs because they differ one to another.
Sure.
But you also are able to balance that you cannot be all for all and you can't meet everyone's needs.
Exactly.
But really to be able to zoom in and prioritize. As a team, I'm a leader of a team. There's a certain mandate. There's a certain objective for which we need to come together to deliver. And the leader deliver results through his or her people, right? It's not so much of being able to churn out the work itself, but how do you motivate the team members under you to be able to then deliver the work in the most effective and the most impactful way. A leader is one, being flexible, being able to draw out strategic insights from the employees, being able to capitalize on what everyone is able to bring and really harmonize that into a final product, which then brings value for the team and the organization. For a good leader, it's also someone who's able to have clear directions and to have clear principles which are consistently followed. The last thing you want is a roti prata boss, right? Someone who say A today and B tomorrow and maybe C and then revert to B again the day after. That kind of leadership is very disruptive. It's highly not conducive for anyone's well-being. Finally, a good leader is one who would be open. You don't have to agree with everything that people say. Naturally, even within our family, the closest to us, we don't always agree on everything. And similarly for a leader and the team members, it's not being able to agree on everything, but how do you bring about a process where you can have open discussions, where you say things in a very safe environment, knowing that you will not be judged or penalized sometime down the road, but really just being able to draw the essence and then collectively agreeing on a common goal and moving forward.
In other words, to disagree without being toxic.
Yes, that would be important.
Because I find that sometimes disagreements become very tense, right? And people go away from that disagreement feeling resentful or just feel negative. But that's a hard skill to master, I feel.
It sounds like a very long list of skill set that any modern leader seems to require right now.
Yeah, demands. But that's why they are paid a lot, lah.
That's true.
The art of leadership development should not rest entirely on the individual. I feel as an organization,
agree.
there are means in which you could perhaps send the person for training. You learn from others who have walked the path before, right? So you could have theoretical concepts taught to you.
Yeah.
And I feel like the making of a leader rests also just as importantly on the team members who therefore shape the leadership and being able to then give inputs constructively and of course respectfully to be able to help the leader grow in his or her
do
role.
his or her best.
Yes.
I think the conundrum for us in our conversation so far is that we find that there are lots of very competent leaders, like you say, right? Able to set direction, very good at what they do. Quite excellent, actually. But a little bit more difficult for them. And because of that, everybody says, oh, it's okay if he's a bit brusque or if he's a bit tough. I think now increasingly that's becoming much more important, right? Not so much about your A-star delivery, but also how you delivered it. Whether your team wants to work with you tomorrow after that stressful thing.
Certainly. I feel that very often we find leaders who are being promoted into their position of leadership really is an outcome of what they've accomplished in terms of the performance at the more junior grade. So what got you there might not necessarily keep you there, right? And therefore, then it's a recognition that there needs to be the acquisition of softer skills, people management skills, communication skills to be able to connect and engage the team. Because what is expected of you as an individual contributor will be very different when you move into a leadership position because the yardsticks, as you rightly pointed out, are different.
Different now. But I think your point is also very important. We shouldn't just put the leaders in the spotlight and say, now you figure this out. It's not fair, right? people need to support them in their journey as well.
But of course, I think support has to be earned, not just be requested from. So in today's context, based on your opinion, do you think there's space in Singapore for a leader like a Steve Jobs, a Elon Musk?
Is Elon Musk a good leader?
I have no idea. But he's the person at the top lah.
I've read articles about their leadership style. It needs to be contextualized to the types of work that they do, the pressures that they're under, the stakeholders that they're accountable to, and also the kind of culture they want to build and advocate. I would say that because there is no also one perfect employee, there's also no one perfect leader. At the end of the day, we need to then be very deliberate in the choice of companies and culture that we put ourselves into. So we do know if, like, say, I am a very high-performing individual, I don't mind straight up direct comments and I don't take it personally and I'm able to bear the stress, then yes, I will go for Elon Musk, which is perfectly fine, right? And you
which
know
is great,
you can show
if that's what you are.
Yes, and you get rewarded accordingly. But if you know that perhaps, such kind of environment might be rather harsh on your well-being, you might not feel you have the ability to cope with that, that's perfectly fine. It's not like one is better than the other.
Exactly.
It's just then be able to find an organization where it's able to bring out the best in you.
That's such a wonderful point. I love that.
And with things becoming more and more volatile as we continue to change at such a rapid pace, we've also been hearing about adaptive leaders. So in your view, what are some of the characteristics that the captain of the ship must be acquiring right now in order to really have their business thrive and manage to get and retain great talent?
They call it volatile world, right? So...
Well, the world has always been volatile. It's just being able to find a safe haven in the midst of volatility where you know that you can contribute and you know that you'll be appreciated and recognized for what you're able to bring. And I think for leaders in moving forward, it's also being able to strategize ahead, being able to use the data that they have on hand to be able to then shape the outcome that they want. For example, the resurgence of tourists back into our shores, right? It is actually an opportunity for STB to revisit our strategy, to relook again what we had embarked on prior to COVID. Is it something that's going to be relevant? Are there going to be tweaks in the way in which we deliver the work? How can we better engage the stakeholders to be able to take on new challenges? One example I have to offer is at STB, we have actually embarked on this journey of sustainable tourism. So prior to HR, where I am right now, I was working in another department which looks at sustainable tourism. And this was actually an area we are very interested in getting our tourism stakeholders to come on board. So it's also being able to look at what's going on in the rest of the world to try to see how can we retain our relevance for it.
So in other words, you have to be, exactly as the word suggests, adaptive. What worked for you in the past may not work for you in the future. So you just constantly need to be thinking about what would work and then get your people along with you.
Something that is always in the background that people may overlook is you really need very strong leaders in order to drive all this initiative across. Otherwise, things can just fall apart.
Yeah, because generally my feeling is that people don't really like change. My sense is that change is it's not a bad thing. It's not negative. It's just that change is tough.
Yeah.
So when you tell them, okay, guys, we have to do this new thing now, you need a lot more than just getting them to follow you. You need persuasion, you need mission-specific ideas. People have to follow you, even though it's hard, right?
Yes, as human beings, we might not be naturally suited to acclimatize so quickly.
Yeah.
But history has shown us that we can. So if you were to recall, prior to the pandemic, going to work means going to the office every day. Right? And when we first had the lockdown, we got everybody to stay at home. That transition, getting people to work from home, was tough. People adapting to that particular change was difficult. And now if you look at it more than 2 years down the road, if we go out and tell people that you have to come into work every day, that's another shock for them, right?
Yeah, they'll say no.
Which is why mask is drawing so much attention. But we forget that actually prior to the pandemic, which wasn't very long ago, we were doing that. That was the norm. So
humans are capable.
We are capable. And we are highly adaptable.
Immense change.
We just need to have a bit more faith in ourselves, in one another, and also to allow ourselves that space and time to be able to adapt.
And someone got to guide the change.
Yes.
So the captain of the ship must have a very steady hands.
Yep. Okay, so we are doing something different for this series. We'll ask offbeat questions and you answer them based on whatever comes to your mind in one short sentence.
Yes.
Okay, so are you ready?
Just give it your best shot.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, first question, that's for me. How do you deal with a problem that's hard to solve?
Like, what's the first thing you do?
Break it down into smaller, digestible chunks.
Good tip. Okay, what do you do when a situation becomes very stressful?
Unless it's life-threatening, generally you can afford to take a step back, catch a breather, and come back to it with new perspective.
Okay, take a deep breath in some cases.
Yes, very deep one.
Count to 10. Sometimes count to 20.
Count
Until you turn
20.
blue.
All right, next one. Complete this sentence. A good leader is someone who...
Is empathetic, willing to tell you as it is in a very diplomatic way, being able to bring about change and growth in you.
Final one for me. How do you ensure that work doesn't become overwhelming?
I think it's important to know how much you can handle and to learn how to say no, to be able to know how to manage your stakeholders and be able to draw boundaries when the time calls for it.
All right. Thanks everyone for listening. We hope you like our limited series. If you have questions you'd like us to ask, please get in touch with us. We are at cnapodcast@mediacorp.com.sg.
The CNA podcast team comprises Joanne Chan, Jacqueline Chan, Tiffany Ang, and Saye Win. I'm Crispina. See you guys next week.